The captain reached across my first-class seat and lifted my boarding pass from the armrests without asking. "Ma'am, I need you to step off this aircraft," he said, loud enough for row 2 to hear. My seat, my paid reservation, and my executive inspection file sat open on the tray table beside my coffee. The passengers behind me went quiet, and the gate agent froze near the cabin door. On my phone, the airline operations app showed this exact aircraft locked under my final departure approval. Then Captain Richard Hayes pressed his thumb against my boarding pass like it belonged to him. That was his first mistake. The cabin air felt too cold. It carried the sharp smell of brewed coffee, leather seats, and jet fuel drifting in from the open boarding door. Overhead lights shone across polished panels. Seat belts clicked. A baby fussed somewhere near the back. The aircraft was still at the gate, but the mood had already changed. My younger sister Mia sat beside me, her hand resting on her purse. She looked from the captain to me, then down at my boarding pass. "Naomi," she whispered, "what is he doing?" I did not answer right away. I watched Captain Hayes fold the pass slightly between his fingers. He had silver hair, a pressed uniform, and the calm face of a man used to being obeyed. "There must be a misunderstanding," I said. My voice stayed low. "This is my assigned seat." He looked at my simple black blazer, then at my carry-on under the footrest. He did not look at the name printed on the document in his hand. "We have a passenger concern," he said, "and I am making a cabin decision." A man across the aisle lowered his newspaper. A woman in row 3 stopped adjusting her earbuds. The flight attendant near the galley, Evelyn Brooks, stood very still with one hand on the curtain. She had seen something on the manifest. I could tell by the way her eyes kept moving back to the tablet in her hand. Captain Hayes noticed her looking. "Evelyn," he said, "please call gate security." Mia's fingers tightened around mine. "We did not do anything," she said softly. The captain turned toward her. "This will be easier if both of you cooperate." That sentence landed harder. Then he knew. I looked past him toward the cockpit door. The aircraft identification plate was mounted beside it, clean and silver under the cabin light. This was Flight 482, the first aircraft scheduled for a quiet service audit before tomorrow's merger vote. My signature controlled the final readiness report. My approval could release or ground the entire executive presentation. But Captain Hayes did not know that yet. He only saw a black woman in first class and decided she needed permission to belong. I took one slow breath. "Captain," I said, "please repeat your reason clearly." His jaw tightened. "You are making other passengers uncomfortable." No one spoke behind him. Not one person. The lie had no support, but he stood inside it anyway. Evelyn stepped closer with her tablet. "Captain Hayes," she said carefully, "her reservation has an executive code attached." He did not turn around. "I am not discussing codes in front of passengers." "Sir," Evelyn said, quieter now, "this one is unusual." He ignored her. That was his second mistake. The gate agent shifted near the door and touched her headset. Outside the aircraft window, orange runway lights blinked through a thin layer of rain. A luggage cart rolled past with a low metallic rattle. Everything looked normal outside. Inside, the air had stopped moving. I reached for my phone, not fast, not dramatic. The screen lit up in my palm. Airline operations. Flight 482 status. Final CO clearance pending. Captain Hayes glanced at the screen for half a second. He frowned, but pride moved faster than recognition. "Put the phone away," he said. I held it still. "Not yet," the gate agent whispered into her headset. Evelyn's tablet chimed once. The sound was small, but every crew member heard it. Then the first-class cabin display above the galley flickered, went dark, and came back with one line in blue text. Executive Review Hold activated. Captain Hayes turned toward the screen, and the color left his face only a little. It was not fear yet. It was the first sign of calculation. Mia leaned closer to me. Her voice barely rose above the engine hum. Naomi, what happens now? I looked at the open cabin door, where two airline executives had just appeared. The flight was no longer only delayed. The two airline executives stopped just inside the aircraft door. Neither of them spoke. They looked first at the cabin display, then at Captain Hayes, and finally at me. Rain tapped softly against the windows outside. The jet bridge creaked as another passenger stepped aside to let them pass. The cabin remained silent. Even the engine seemed quieter. Captain Hayes slipped my boarding pass back onto the armrest. "This area is restricted while we resolve a security concern," he said. His voice sounded steady. His shoulders did not. I looked at him without moving. "What exactly is the concern?" He folded his arms. "You are refusing a crew instruction." I asked for the reason. He did not answer. Evelyn stood beside the galley curtain with her tablet held against her chest. The notification light continued blinking. She glanced toward one of the executives, hoping he would speak first. He remained still. Mia leaned closer to me. "Everyone is watching," she whispered. "I know." Her fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag. I could hear her breathing above the faint rush of conditioned air. She had flown with me many times before. She had never seen a cabin become this quiet. One of the executives finally stepped forward. He wore a navy suit without a company pin. His expression remained carefully neutral. "Captain Hayes," he said, "may we review the manifest together?" The captain shook his head once. "I am handling the situation. The aircraft is currently under executive review." "Then executive review can wait until the cabin is secure." The executive did not argue. He simply looked toward the display above the galley. The blue message still glowed. "Executive review hold activated." Every flight attendant could see it. Every crew member knew that message did not appear by accident. A businessman across the aisle quietly closed his laptop. A young mother in the second row lifted her sleeping child a little closer. No one complained. No one demanded departure. They simply watched. Sometimes silence carried more judgment than words ever could. My phone vibrated once. A secure notification appeared across the screen. Flight 482 board access confirmed. Executive audit team on site. I locked the screen again without opening the message. Captain Hayes noticed the movement. "I asked you to put that phone away." "You did." "Then comply." "Not while this review is active." His jaw tightened again. Evelyn took one cautious step forward. "Captain Operations is requesting acknowledgement." She turned the tablet so only he could see it. His eyes scanned the display for barely a second before he pushed it gently back toward her. "Tell them I will respond after departure." Evelyn hesitated. "Sir, the aircraft has not been cleared for departure." That sentence landed softly, but it reached every row in first class. The executive beside the boarding door looked toward the gate agent. She immediately removed her headset and nodded once. Something had changed outside the aircraft. Through the open cabin door I could see two additional people walking down the jet bridge. Both carried black portfolios instead of luggage. Neither wore airport security uniforms. Captain Hayes noticed them too. "Who authorized more personnel?" he asked sharply. No one answered him. I rested my hand on the armrest beside my untouched coffee. It had already grown cold. The rich aroma had faded, replaced by the faint metallic scent that always drifted through an aircraft waiting too long at the gate. Time felt different now. Every minute without departure created new reports. New records. New questions. Mia looked toward the boarding door. "Do they work for the airline?" she asked quietly. "Yes," I answered. "They do." The first executive turned back toward Captain Hayes. "Before anything else happens," he said calmly, "there is one document we need you to read." Captain Hayes reached for the folder, unaware whose signature waited inside. Captain Hayes accepted the folder without looking at me. The paper made a soft sound as he opened it. Rain continued tapping against the windows. The boarding door remained open. Cold air drifted into the first-class cabin, carrying the faint smell of wet concrete and jet fuel. No one reached for the overhead bins anymore. No one asked when the flight would leave. Every passenger had become part of the same quiet moment. Captain Hayes scanned the first page. His expression did not change. He turned to the second page. Then the third. "This does not affect my authority on this aircraft," he said. His voice was firm, but slower than before. The executive standing beside him folded his hands. "Please continue reading." Hayes lowered his eyes again. Evelyn watched him carefully. She had stopped pretending to organize the galley. Her tablet remained awake in her hands. Another notification appeared across the screen. She swallowed before locking it. Mia leaned toward me. "What is in that folder?" she whispered. "The procedures for tonight," I answered quietly. "Nothing more." She looked at me with a puzzled expression. "You sound very calm." I smiled faintly. "Calm helps people reveal themselves." Across the aisle, the businessman quietly removed his glasses. He looked from the captain to the executives, then back to me. His newspaper remained folded on his lap. He had stopped reading several minutes earlier. Captain Hayes closed the folder. "I still believe removing this passenger is the correct decision." The first executive nodded once. "May I ask why?" "Her presence has disrupted the cabin." "Before or after your instruction?" Hayes hesitated. "That is not the point." "It is exactly the point." The words settled into the silence without force. Evelyn finally spoke again. "Captain, every passenger remains seated until your announcement." Hayes turned toward her. "Are you questioning my judgment?" She drew one careful breath. "I am describing what I observed." That answer changed the atmosphere inside the cabin. Another flight attendant near the boarding doors slowly looked up from the beverage cart. She had heard every word. Outside, 2 ramp workers paused beneath the wing and looked toward the aircraft. Something on their radios had caught their attention. The gate agent stepped inside again. "Captain Hayes," she said politely, "Operations has placed a temporary departure hold on Flight 482. He frowned. "For how long?" "Until executive authorization is completed." His eyes shifted toward me. For barely a second before moving away again. He still refused to connect the pieces. I rested my phone on the closed tray table. The screen remained dark now. I did not need to look at it. The system was already moving. The first executive opened his portfolio and removed another document. Unlike the first folder, this one carried a blue executive seal across the top corner. He held it without opening it. "Captain Hayes," he said, "before we proceed, I need you to answer one question for the official record." Hayes straightened his uniform jacket. "Go ahead. Did you verify the passenger manifest before asking Miss Carter to leave her assigned seat?" The cabin became completely still. Even the soft hum from the air vents seemed farther away. Hayes answered after only a brief pause. "No." Evelyn lowered her eyes. The businessman slowly exhaled. Mia looked at me, then back toward the captain. The admission had changed everything, even if he had not realized it yet. The executive placed the unopened document back into his portfolio. "Thank you," he said calmly. "That answer will remain with the report." Hayes looked toward the boarding door as another pair of polished shoes appeared on the jet bridge. Someone important had just arrived. The polished shoes stopped at the aircraft door. The cabin stayed silent. Rain shimmered across the jet bridge windows behind the newcomer, turning the evening light into pale silver reflections. He carried no suitcase. Only a slim leather portfolio rested beneath one arm. The first executive stepped aside immediately. "Thomas Reed," Evelyn whispered under her breath. Mia looked at me. "Do you know him?" I answered quietly. "Yes." Thomas Reed entered the first-class cabin with slow, measured steps. He greeted the flight attendants with a polite nod before looking toward Captain Hayes. His expression revealed nothing. Years of leadership had taught him how to observe before speaking. Captain Hayes straightened his jacket. "Good evening," he said, We are resolving a passenger issue. Thomas looked briefly toward me, then toward the executive display still glowing above the galley. Executive review hold activated. His eyes returned to the captain. So I have been informed. The cabin lights reflected softly across the polished floor. Coffee cups remained untouched. A flight attendant quietly removed a service tray to clear the aisle. Nobody wanted unnecessary movement now. Every sound seemed louder than usual. Thomas folded his portfolio against his chest. Captain Hayes, before we continue, has anyone asked Miss Carter for identification? Hayes answered immediately. No. Has anyone confirmed her reservation? The reservation exists. Has anyone confirmed her executive travel authorization? Hayes paused. That was not necessary. Thomas nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully. Interesting. He did not argue. He simply accepted the answer. Sometimes agreement revealed more than disagreement. Evelyn glanced at her tablet once again. Another secure message appeared. She inhaled softly before locking the screen. I noticed the small movement. Thomas noticed it too. Across the aisle, the businessman quietly placed his newspaper inside his briefcase. He leaned back without saying a word. The young mother gently rocked her sleeping child. Even ordinary moments felt important inside the stillness. Captain Hayes looked toward the boarding door. If operations wishes to discuss procedures, we can do so after departure. Thomas smiled politely. There will not be a departure until this review is complete. Hayes frowned. The passengers deserve to leave on time. Thomas nodded. They also deserve confidence in the people responsible for their safety. The sentence lingered in the air. Nobody challenged it. Mia shifted slightly beside me. Naomi, she whispered, this is becoming much bigger. I looked toward the rain beyond the window. It already was. Thomas opened his portfolio at last. Inside rested a thin blue folder with the airline crest embossed across the cover. He removed a single page and handed it to Captain Hayes. Please read the highlighted section aloud. Hayes accepted the document reluctantly. His eyes moved across the paragraph. He stopped halfway through. His brow tightened. Continue, Thomas said gently. Hayes swallowed once before reading again. Executive. Operational audits may be conducted without prior notification. All personnel decisions made during the audit become part of the permanent leadership evaluation record. He lowered the page. This is an audit? Thomas looked directly at him. It is now. Evelyn closed her eyes for the briefest moment. The gate agent quietly stepped back onto the jet bridge. Outside, another airport vehicle rolled to a stop beneath the aircraft. Its amber lights flashed across the cabin ceiling. Hayes looked from Thomas to me and back again. For the first time that evening, uncertainty replaced certainty. He studied my face more carefully than before, searching for something he should have noticed earlier. I remained seated. My coffee had gone completely cold. My boarding pass still rested where he had placed it. The only thing that had changed was the weight of the silence surrounding it. Thomas slipped the remaining documents back into his portfolio. Captain, he said calmly, there is one question you still have not asked her. Hayes slowly turned toward me as the answer began to find him. Captain Hayes looked at me for several long seconds. The confidence that had carried him through the evening no longer rested comfortably on his face. He opened his mouth once, then stopped. The question Thomas Reed mentioned remained unspoken. Rain continued sliding across the aircraft windows. The flashing amber lights outside reflected across the ceiling panels in slow pulses. Nobody reached for a seat belt. Nobody asked about departure anymore. The entire cabin had shifted from travel to observation. Thomas remained calm. Captain, he said quietly, ask her the question. Hayes drew a careful breath. Miss Carter, he began. Why are you traveling under executive audit authorization? I held his gaze. Because I approved it. His expression tightened. Approved it? Yes. I kept my voice steady. Personally. Mia looked at me, then smiled faintly. She already knew where the conversation was going. She simply waited for everyone else to catch up. Evelyn lowered her tablet. Her shoulders relaxed for the first time since boarding. She had spent the last several minutes trying to balance procedure against authority. Now procedure was beginning to speak for itself. Thomas folded his hands. Captain Hayes, did you review the executive audit schedule issued this morning? Hayes answered honestly. No. Did you attend the briefing? I delegated it. Thomas nodded once. Did you read the executive memo that followed? Hayes remained silent for a moment. No. Another quiet settled over the cabin. It was no longer uncomfortable. It was revealing. The businessman across the aisle slowly shook his head. The young mother gently adjusted the blanket covering her sleeping child. Small movements filled the silence more naturally than words. I reached for my coffee cup. The coffee had gone cold. I set it back down untouched. Captain, I said, may I ask you one question? He looked directly at me. Go ahead. Before asking me to leave my seat, what did you actually know about me? He hesitated. Very little. Did you know where I worked? No. Did you know why I was traveling? No. Did you know whether I had followed every boarding procedure? His shoulders lowered slightly. No. I nodded. Yet you reached a conclusion. He looked toward the floor for the first time that evening. Thomas watched quietly. He never interrupted. Leadership sometimes required silence more than speeches. Evelyn finally spoke. Captain, I tried to mention the executive travel code. Hayes answered without looking at her. You did. I should have insisted. I turned toward her. You respected the chain of command. That matters. She swallowed. It did not feel right. Feeling that difference matters too. Her eyes softened. Outside the boarding door, another member of the executive audit team arrived carrying a sealed document case. The gate agent accepted it and immediately handed it to Thomas. He opened the case carefully and removed a single identification folder. The airline crest shimmered beneath the cabin lights. Thomas walked toward me instead of toward the captain. He stopped beside my seat and held the folder with both hands. For the record, he said, would you please verify your executive credentials? I accepted the folder and opened it slowly. Inside rested my company identification card and the signed authorization for the merger inspection tour. I looked at the card only briefly before handing it back. Thomas examined it for a second, then faced Captain Hayes. Identity confirmed, he said calmly. Hayes stared at the identification without speaking. The color slowly drained from his face. His eyes moved from the card to me again. This time he did not see an ordinary passenger. He saw every decision he had made over the last 20 minutes. Thomas closed the folder with a quiet click. There is still one introduction left, he said, as footsteps approached from the jet bridge. The footsteps stopped at the aircraft door. No one entered immediately. The delay lasted only a few seconds, but inside the quiet cabin it felt much longer. Thomas Reed looked toward the jet bridge and gave a respectful nod. Captain Hayes followed his eyes. His posture stiffened again. He was waiting for someone who outranked him. The cabin lights reflected across the polished cockpit door. The faint scent of coffee mixed with cool air drifting through the open entrance. Outside, rain continued falling across the airport ramp. A baggage cart rolled slowly beneath the wing. Everything beyond the aircraft moved normally. Inside, time seemed to stand still. A woman in a charcoal business suit stepped through the doorway carrying a slim tablet. She greeted Thomas first. The board has assembled in the executive lounge, she said quietly. They are waiting for the inspection to begin. Thomas accepted the tablet. Thank you, Claire. Captain Hayes looked from her to me again. He still said nothing. Claire glanced briefly toward my seat before lowering her eyes with professional respect. It was a small gesture. Evelyn noticed it immediately. Mia noticed it too. Naomi, she whispered. Everyone who arrives already knows. I gave a small nod. They do. Thomas opened the tablet and reviewed a short report. Flight 482 remains on executive hold, he said. Maintenance is complete. Weather clearance is complete. Passenger boarding is complete. The only unresolved item is the leadership review. Captain Hayes drew a slow breath. You are delaying an entire flight because of me? Thomas answered calmly. No. The delay began when procedure was abandoned. That distinction settled over the cabin. The businessman across the aisle leaned back in his seat. The young mother looked toward the window, then quietly smiled at her sleeping child. Nobody appeared impatient anymore. They understood they were witnessing something larger than an ordinary delay. Evelyn stepped closer to Captain Hayes. Sir, she said gently, would you like me to complete the incident report? He looked at her for several seconds before answering. Yes. She opened the reporting application on her tablet. Please describe what happened from the beginning. Hayes hesitated. He looked toward me. Then toward my boarding pass resting on the armrest. Finally he answered. I approached a passenger before confirming the manifest. Evelyn entered every word without interruption. The sound of her fingertips touching the screen was barely audible. Continue, she said softly. I assumed she was occupying the wrong seat. Another pause followed. Without verification. Evelyn recorded that sentence too. Thomas remained silent. He never corrected the captain. He simply allowed the truth to arrive one sentence at a time. I rested both hands on the armrests. Captain, I said quietly, do you remember the first thing you asked me? He nodded. I asked you to leave the aircraft? You never asked whether I belonged there. His shoulders lowered another inch. No. That difference matters. He looked directly at me now. For the first time since boarding, he was listening instead of deciding. Claire received another secure message and handed the tablet to Thomas. He reviewed it briefly before smiling almost imperceptibly. The board is ready, he said. They have one request. Captain Hayes looked confused. A request? Thomas nodded. Yes. He turned toward me. They would like the inspection to begin exactly where the evening changed. Mia looked around the first-class cabin. Here? Thomas smiled. Right here. The cabin display above the galley flickered once more. The blue message disappeared. A new line of text appeared beneath the airline logo. Executive Leadership Review now in progress. Captain Hayes slowly looked up at the display, then back at me. He finally understood where this meeting had truly begun. Someone else stepped onto the aircraft. Someone stepped onto the aircraft wearing a simple dark overcoat instead of a formal executive suit. The cabin did not recognize him immediately. Thomas Reed did. He moved aside without hesitation. Evelyn straightened instinctively. Even the gate agent outside lowered her headset. The man carried nothing except a slim notebook tucked beneath one arm. He paused just inside the boarding door and quietly looked around the first-class cabin before speaking. Please continue exactly as you were, he said. His voice was calm. Nobody moved. Nobody sat straighter. Nobody relaxed either. Captain Hayes looked confused. May I ask who you are? The man smiled politely but did not answer. Instead, he walked slowly down the aisle, observing every face. He noticed the untouched coffee beside my seat. He noticed Mia's nervous hands folded in her lap. He noticed Evelyn still holding the incident report open on her tablet. Finally, he stopped beside Thomas. Has anyone changed their statement? He asked. No, Thomas replied. Good. The man nodded once. Honest first reactions usually teach us the most. Captain Hayes shifted his weight. Sir, I still do not understand why this has become such a large review. The visitor turned toward him. Leadership reviews become large only when small decisions reveal larger problems. His words settled gently across the cabin. The businessman across the aisle quietly closed his eyes for a brief moment. The young mother looked toward the window again. Rain continued tracing narrow lines across the glass. Outside, airport workers continued their routines. Fuel trucks rolled past. Service vehicles crossed the ramp. The ordinary world had not stopped. Only this cabin had. Mia leaned toward me. "Who is he?" she whispered. "One of the people I trust most," I answered softly. She nodded without asking another question. The visitor looked toward Evelyn. "You attempted to verify the manifest?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" "Because something did not match the executive code." "Did anyone instruct you to ignore it?" Evelyn hesitated before answering. "No. I stopped because the captain had already made his decision." The visitor wrote a single line inside his notebook. He thanked her with a small nod. Then he faced Captain Hayes again. "If a member of your crew notices information you have missed, what should happen?" Hayes answered quietly. "I should listen." "Did you?" A long pause followed. "No." The notebook opened once more. Another short line appeared. I watched without speaking. Silence often invited more honesty than argument. The visitor turned toward me. "Miss Carter, did you ever refuse a lawful instruction?" "No." "Did you ever raise your voice?" "No." "Did you threaten anyone?" "No." He smiled faintly. "Thank you." His attention returned to the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience this evening. Your cooperation has helped preserve an accurate account of what occurred." Several passengers acknowledged him with quiet nods. No one complained about the delay. No one demanded compensation. They had seen enough to understand that fairness sometimes required time. Thomas glanced at his watch. "The board has postponed the merger briefing until the review concludes." Captain Hayes looked genuinely surprised. "They postponed the entire meeting?" Thomas answered calmly. "People matter before schedules." Those words remained in the air long after he finished speaking. The visitor closed his notebook and handed it to Thomas. "Everything we needed happened before I arrived," he said. "Now one conversation remains." Captain Hayes slowly lifted his eyes toward me as though he finally understood who needed to speak next. Captain Hayes looked at me for a long moment before taking a single step forward. The cabin remained silent. Rain continued sliding across the windows beside the first-class seats. The overhead lights reflected softly against polished luggage bins. Somewhere outside, a baggage loader rolled past with a slow metallic rumble. Inside the aircraft, nobody seemed aware of anything except the conversation waiting to happen. Thomas Reed stepped quietly toward the galley. He deliberately moved out of the center of the aisle. The visitor with the notebook did the same. Neither man intended to lead the next moment. They had already decided who should. Captain Hayes stopped beside my seat. He no longer stood over me. His posture had changed. His shoulders were lower. His hands rested calmly at his sides instead of folded across his chest. Evelyn quietly locked her tablet. She had finished recording the factual sequence. Everything after this belonged to people rather than procedures. Mia looked toward me. "You do not have to answer him," she whispered. I smiled gently. "Sometimes answers matter." Captain Hayes drew a careful breath. "Miss Carter," he said softly, "before tonight we had never met." "That is correct." "I made assumptions." "You did." He nodded once. "I believed I was protecting the cabin. Did you protect it?" He looked around the first-class section. The businessman sat quietly. The young mother continued rocking her sleeping child. No passenger appeared afraid. No passenger appeared relieved. They simply watched. Hayes answered honestly. "No." I rested one hand on the armrest beside my boarding pass. "You protected an assumption." His eyes lowered briefly. "Yes." The words came more easily now. Honesty usually did. The visitor opened his notebook again but did not write. He only listened. Thomas remained beside the galley without interrupting. Leadership sometimes required witnesses more than speakers. Evelyn stepped closer. "Captain," she said gently, "may I tell you something?" He looked toward her. "Of course." When I first saw the executive code, I was not thinking about rank. She paused briefly. I was thinking that every passenger deserves the same careful verification. Hayes nodded slowly. You were right. She smiled faintly. It was the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her all evening. I looked toward the window. Rainwater traced narrow paths across the glass before disappearing beneath the wing. Airport lights shimmered through every drop. Captain, I said quietly, what did you notice first when you approached me? He answered after only a short pause. Your seat. Not. Me? No. Then what? He hesitated. I noticed where you were sitting. Another quiet settled across the cabin. The distinction mattered. And after that? I asked. He looked directly into my eyes. I noticed your appearance. Before my boarding pass? Yes. Before the manifest? Yes. Before asking my name? He closed his eyes briefly. Yes. Nobody judged him aloud. Nobody needed to. His own answers carried enough weight. The visitor finally wrote one short sentence inside the notebook before closing it again. Thomas looked toward him. The visitor simply nodded once. Nothing more needed recording. Mia slowly relaxed her grip on her handbag. She leaned back against her seat for the first time since boarding. The tension inside her shoulders had begun to fade. Across the aisle, the businessman quietly spoke for the first time all evening. Captain, he said respectfully, the calmest person in this cabin has been the one questioned the most. Hayes looked toward him and nodded. You are right. The cabin display above the galley chimed softly. The blue review notice remained visible, but a second line appeared beneath it. Executive Board connected. Thomas glanced at the screen before turning toward me. They are ready whenever you are, he said calmly. I looked once more at Captain Hayes. His expression was no longer defensive. It was searching. One answer still had to be spoken. Thomas looked at the cabin display before returning his attention to me. The board is connected, he said. They are waiting for your decision. I nodded once but remained seated. The engines continued their low, steady hum beneath the floor. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The aircraft still rested at the gate. No one reached for the overhead bins. No one checked a watch anymore. Time had stopped belonging to the schedule. It belonged to the moment. Captain Hayes stood quietly in the aisle. His hands no longer rested on authority. They rested at his sides. His eyes met mine without challenge for the first time that evening. Miss Carter, he said, there is something I should have asked when I first walked into this cabin. I waited. May I know your name? A faint smile crossed my face. Naomi Carter. He nodded slowly, repeating it to himself as though the simple act of learning another person's name carried its own lesson. Thank you. Evelyn watched the exchange with visible relief. She quietly slipped her tablet beneath one arm. The incident report had already captured the facts. What happened now could not be measured by forms or procedures. Mia leaned back into her seat and released a slow breath. That sounds different, she whispered. Names usually do, I answered. Thomas stepped forward one pace. Captain Hayes, before the board joins us, there's one final verification. Hayes looked toward him. Thomas opened his portfolio and removed a slim executive folder embossed with the airline crest. He handed it to the captain without speaking. Hayes opened it carefully. The first page displayed my executive authorization. The second contained the organizational chart for the merger. The third listed the current corporate leadership team. His eyes stopped on the final page. He looked back at me immediately. Then down again. His breathing slowed. The businessman across the aisle noticed the change before anyone else. He quietly folded his hands together and looked toward the window, giving the captain a moment of dignity. The young mother gently brushed a strand of hair away from her sleeping child's forehead. Small acts of kindness seemed to appear everywhere once people stopped rushing. Hayes closed the folder with careful hands. Thomas, he said quietly, is this current? Updated this morning. There is no mistake? None. Silence settled through the first-class cabin once more. It no longer felt tense. It felt honest. Hayes looked directly at me. You are the Chief Executive Officer. I answered simply. Yes. No one gasped. No dramatic reaction echoed through the cabin. The truth arrived quietly. That somehow made it stronger. Evelyn lowered her eyes for a brief second before looking back at me with respectful recognition. Thomas gave a small nod. The visitor with the notebook closed it completely and slipped it into his coat pocket. He had expected this moment from the beginning. Hayes spoke again, his voice almost a whisper. I asked the Chief Executive Officer to leave her own aircraft. I shook my head gently. No. He looked confused. You asked a passenger to leave without first seeing her as a person. That happened before you knew any title. He absorbed the words without interruption. They reached him more deeply than any formal reprimand could have. Thomas looked toward the cabin display. A soft chime sounded overhead. The blue review notice disappeared. In its place appeared a single line of gold text. Executive identity verified. Board session ready? Every crew member looked toward me at the same time. Captain Hayes remained standing in the aisle, waiting for whatever I would say next. The gold message remained above the galley. Executive identity verified. Board session ready? No one looked away from it for several seconds. Then every eye returned to me. The engines continued their quiet hum beneath the cabin floor. Rain rolled across the windows in slow silver lines. The aircraft still waited at the gate, but the evening had already traveled much farther than any flight plan. Thomas Reed remained beside the aisle without speaking. The visitor with the notebook stepped back another pace. He had finished observing. The next decision belonged to me alone. Captain Hayes stood where he was. His uniform was still perfectly pressed, yet something about him had changed. Confidence had given way to reflection. He looked at me and spoke carefully. Miss Carter, I owe you an apology. I listened without interrupting. I judged your place before I confirmed your reservation. I ignored my crew. I ignored the manifest. Most importantly, I failed to treat you with the dignity every passenger deserves. His voice remained steady, but quieter than before. I am sincerely sorry. The cabin stayed silent. Nobody rushed to fill the pause. Evelyn looked toward me with calm expectation. Mia rested her hands in her lap and waited. Even the businessman across the aisle kept his eyes lowered, giving the apology room to exist on its own. I finally answered. Thank you for saying it. Hayes nodded once. I understand if that is not enough. I looked toward the window. Airport. Lights shimmered across the rain outside. A service truck passed slowly beneath the wing. Ordinary work continued while extraordinary lessons unfolded inside the cabin. An apology cannot change the beginning of tonight, I said. But it can change what happens after it. Thomas quietly folded his portfolio. The visitor with the notebook smiled almost imperceptibly. They understood exactly where the conversation was going. I turned toward Evelyn. You tried to verify the information before reaching a conclusion. She nodded. Yes. Keep doing that. She smiled gently. I will. Then I looked at Captain Hayes again. You believed authority meant making the fastest decision. He lowered his eyes. Yes. Leadership usually begins by asking one more question. He absorbed the sentence without defending himself. I understand now. Mia looked toward me with a small smile. She had heard me repeat that lesson to young managers for years. It sounded different inside an airplane cabin. The businessman finally spoke again. The delay was worth it. Several nearby passengers nodded quietly. No one complained about missed connections. No one mentioned schedules. They had witnessed something far more lasting than an on-time departure. Thomas glanced toward the cabin display. The board is waiting for your recommendation, he said. They will support whatever course you believe reflects the company's values. I remained seated for another moment. I looked once more at Captain Hayes. then at Evelyn. Then at every passenger who had chosen patience over frustration. This review was never about finding the most powerful person on the aircraft, I said. It was about discovering whether our culture still exists when no one believes the chief executive officer is watching. No one answered. They did not need to. The truth already filled the cabin. Thomas gave a respectful nod. The board is ready to hear your decision. I slowly unfastened my seat belt and stood. I stood slowly. The seat belt slipped back into its place with a quiet click. Every sound inside the cabin seemed sharper now. Rain continued tapping against the windows. The engines maintained their steady rhythm. Beneath the floor, no one spoke. Thomas Reed stepped aside, leaving the aisle completely open. He did not introduce me. He no longer needed to. Captain Hayes remained where he was, his hands relaxed at his sides. He looked like a man listening instead of leading. I appreciated the difference. I looked around the first-class cabin before saying a single word. Every passenger had become part of the same story without choosing to. Evelyn still held her tablet, but the screen had gone dark. Mia watched me quietly with the calm expression she always carried when she knew I had already made my decision. "Thank you for your patience," I said to the passengers. "You expected a flight. Instead, you witnessed a difficult conversation." A few people smiled politely. Others simply nodded. The businessman across the aisle folded his hands together. The young mother adjusted the blanket over her sleeping child once more. Their attention never drifted away. I turned toward Captain Hayes. "You asked me to leave before asking my name." He nodded. "Yes." "You decided before verifying the facts." "Yes." "Tonight will become part of your leadership review." "I understand." His voice remained steady. There was no attempt to argue. No attempt to protect himself. That mattered. Thomas quietly observed without interrupting. The visitor with the notebook remained near the boarding door, watching the conversation unfold exactly as it had needed to. I walked one step into the aisle. "Captain Hayes, leadership is not measured only by the decisions we make when everything is easy." He listened carefully. "It is measured by the people we choose to see when assumptions become convenient." He lowered his eyes for a brief moment before looking back at me. "I lost sight of that." "Yes," I answered gently. "You did." The silence that followed felt different from every silence earlier that evening. It no longer carried tension. It carried reflection. Evelyn took a slow breath. "Miss Carter," she said softly, "may I say something?" "Of course." I almost stopped speaking when I realized the captain disagreed with me. She paused. "Next time I will respectfully continue until the facts are verified." I smiled. That is exactly what I hope every crew member will do. Thomas made a short note inside his portfolio. Mia looked toward Evelyn with quiet encouragement. The businessman spoke again. "Good companies teach policies," he said. "Great companies teach courage." Thomas looked toward him and nodded once. "I agree." I turned back toward Captain Hayes. "The board expects a recommendation from me." He accepted that without flinching. "Whatever you decide, I will accept it." I studied his face for several seconds. Pride had disappeared. Responsibility had taken its place. There was a meaningful difference between those two things. I looked toward Thomas. "Please continue the review through our normal process. Preserve every recording, every statement, and every report exactly as they are. No special treatment. No exceptions." Thomas answered immediately. "It will be done." I nodded once. That is how trust survives. Captain Hayes quietly thanked me for allowing the process to remain fair. I did not respond right away. Fairness was never a gift. It was the standard everyone deserved. The cabin display chimed softly once more, and a new notification appeared beneath the airline logo. The board had reached its next decision. The notification remained on the cabin display for several quiet seconds. No one rushed to read it aloud. The soft gold letters reflected faintly across the polished overhead bins while rain continued tracing slow paths down the windows. Outside, the airport lights shimmered through the mist. Inside, every face remained turned toward the aisle. Thomas Reed glanced at the display before looking back at me. "The board has accepted your recommendation," he said calmly. "The formal review will proceed through the normal process." I nodded once. That is the only way it should. Captain Hayes stood silently. Relief did not appear on his face. Neither did fear. He seemed to understand that accountability was not about punishment alone. It was about whether someone chose to become different after seeing the truth. Evelyn quietly slipped her tablet into her flight bag. The report was complete. Every statement had been recorded exactly as spoken. Nothing had been rewritten. Nothing had been softened. Facts deserved that respect. Mia looked toward me with a gentle smile. "You could have ended this very differently," she whispered. I smiled back. "Power should make people safer, not smaller." She nodded without another word. Thomas closed his portfolio. "The merger briefing can begin whenever you are ready." I looked around the first-class cabin instead. The businessman across the aisle offered a respectful nod. The young mother adjusted her child's blanket one last time. Another passenger quietly thanked Evelyn as she walked past. Small moments of kindness had returned to the cabin without anyone announcing them. That mattered more than the meeting waiting ahead. I turned toward Evelyn. "When new crew members begin training next month, I would like this evening included in the leadership curriculum." Her eyes widened slightly. "The entire evening?" "Yes." "Including the mistakes?" "Especially the mistakes." Thomas immediately made another note. "We can prepare the material." I looked toward Captain Hayes. "Your experience will become part of that lesson if you are willing." He appeared surprised. "You would want me involved?" "If you are prepared to speak honestly about what happened," he answered without hesitation. "I am. Then perhaps someone else will avoid making the same mistake." He slowly nodded. Gratitude replaced embarrassment for just a moment. It was quiet, but genuine. The visitor with the notebook finally spoke again. "Organizations improve when truth becomes instruction instead of rumor." Thomas smiled faintly. "That is worth remembering." I picked up my boarding pass from the armrest where it had rested since the beginning of the evening. The paper was slightly bent where Captain Hayes had held it. I carefully smoothed the edge with my thumb before placing it inside my travel folder. It was a small gesture, but it felt complete. Evelyn stepped toward the front of the cabin and picked up the public address handset. She looked toward Captain Hayes first. He gave a small nod. Then she looked toward me. I returned the nod. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said warmly, "thank you for your patience this evening. We will begin boarding completion shortly. We appreciate your understanding." No one applauded. No one celebrated. The passengers simply settled back into their seats with a different kind of quiet. The cabin no longer felt divided. It felt shared. Thomas looked toward the cockpit, then back at me. "Everything is ready." I glanced once more through the rain-covered window before taking my next step toward the front of the aircraft. I walked toward the front of the cabin one quiet step at a time. The carpet softened every footfall. Rain still drifted across the windows, but the storm outside had begun to fade. The runway lights stretched into long golden reflections beneath the wing. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere had changed completely. The tension that greeted me when I boarded had slowly given way to something calmer. Something honest. Thomas Reed opened the cockpit door just enough to speak with the operations team before closing it again. Captain Hayes remained beside the entrance to first class. He did not step in front of me. He simply waited. When I reached him, he extended my boarding pass with both hands. The edge I had smoothed moments earlier was perfectly straight again. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "welcome aboard." I accepted the boarding pass with a small nod. "Thank you, Captain." Those two simple words carried more meaning than any speech either of us could have given. Evelyn watched the exchange with a gentle smile. Mia gathered her handbag and stood beside me. She looked around the cabin once before whispering, "It feels different now." "People do that," I answered. "When they choose to." Thomas returned from the cockpit. "Operations has cleared the aircraft for departure," he said. "The board will meet after landing." I nodded. "That is exactly where the meeting belongs." He smiled. "Some lessons are better learned before the conference room." The passengers quietly resumed their ordinary routines. A businessman reopened his laptop. The young mother kissed the forehead of her sleeping child. Someone folded a newspaper. Another passenger looked out at the rain with a peaceful expression. Life had returned to the cabin, but not quite the same life that had existed before. Evelyn completed the final cabin check. This time she paused beside every passenger with the same warm professionalism. Nothing about her kindness depended on appearance. Captain Hayes watched her for a moment before speaking softly. "She reminded me what I should have remembered first." I looked toward Evelyn. "The best leaders often do." He nodded slowly. There was no need for another apology. His willingness to learn had already become part of it. The aircraft door closed with a deep mechanical sound. The jet bridge slowly pulled away. Outside, the rain became lighter still. The engines grew stronger beneath the cabin floor as preparations for departure finally began. I looked once more through the window before fastening my seat belt. Water slipped away from the glass, revealing a clearer view of the runway ahead. It felt symbolic without trying to be. Thomas settled into the seat